classy.
Still, they like a clean.
So
How you
done
how you
by.
are is how your dishes will be.
And so I just lost my voice. Just like that. Linda, you met Jonathan maybe? Good. Everybody knows good. As long as everybody.
I mean, we don't have to be up super early, right?
Well,
Okay.
did you guys take part in Heart and Soul dinners last night?
That's what we're
You
gonna
guys were looking
Is there anything else that you want to try to get done that day since we're
gotta tell you, if you're not on the list of that, I think
Well,
that we're
I
not
know
gonna do
that
it
would
through
be
the summer.
just that whole.
But that's a darn good list to be on, that's all I have to say. So,
Once we can kind of get.
groups of about 3 or 4 families, will meet at one family's home.
I don't know,
for
I'll look
dinner.
and see.
It's
That's my
usually the last Friday
priority.
every month. And,
then,
like I say, it's gonna kind of probably take it easy for the summer months, but,
might not be that much, it might be.
yeah, but I'll tell you, it's worth thinking about for the next couple of months, it really is.
But if I can, come on.
For those of us who are already tired of summer.
If you find anything else,
you can
take care of it.
Okay. Yeah, and I think probably kind of have to have that.
So, thanks everyone for being here. There's a couple of extra books up here if you need them. I know that Chris Brown asked me to bring some more copies of this chart. I don't have a lot of them, but I have some of them. We have to leave one for Chris. But yeah. I think, James, did you get this?
Yes.
Okay, you didn't get one, did you? You got one, good. So as long, thank you, Randy, but as long as we have, we gotta keep one for Chris, or else use them all up, and then Chris will feel bad for being late. But, yeah, he deserves anything he gets. So, all right, we have been we're going through chapter by chapter. I'm going to be covering things that are in chapter 3 today. Chapter 3 is a fairly short, chapter, but it handles the first big question that comes out of my questions from chapter 1, which begin on page 9. And the first question that starts to sift us towards our worldview is reality knowable or unknowable? And since I just gave you that handout, probably need one for myself. But you see on the diagram here that first question is kind of within the context of the diagram. The ultimate reality section here. Is it knowable or is it unknowable? And that's the first question. That's where things divide. Can you see how that's kind of working on the diagram? And things divide in that way. So, ultimate reality, I talked about last week. For the most part, if you're even close to my age, like within half of it, you probably grew up in a world that there was very little suggestion that ultimate reality was unknowable. Very little suggestion. If you are a quarter of my age, which puts you in high school, middle school range, and nobody's here, so we can talk about it. Very few of middle school, high school students these days believe that you can know anything, that you can know ultimate reality. And so it's kind of almost unbelievable. As I was mentioning last week, there's a very small percentage of people who in the 1940s, it would have been like 1 out of 1,000 people. And those people that believed that ultimate reality was unknowable are probably either hardcore crazy, I will just go that way, completely disconnected from reality, Or there were a few people that kind of fit the category that in the literary world believed that things were unknowable. There were philosophers coming through, Wittgenstein and some others that were kind of coming through in the early part of the last century, and then in the mid to late part, we had a whole slew of them. Foucault and Sartre and Derrida and Dada was one of the guys' names, and those guys became professors. Berkeley hired them all, and they literally teach that you can't know reality. And some of the big ones were guys like Dada, Derrida, who really taught that anything that would be considered to be objective, absolute truth could be deconstructed. And as you deconstruct it, there's no such thing as truth anymore. And because it tears it apart, you find out that things that we believe are true when you really, like, God is love, and then you start tearing that down. And well, what is love? What is God? And then pretty soon they get themselves to a place where nothing is love, because if you're not just super nice, then that's not loving. If you're not super generous, then that's not loving. And one of the things that Derrida said is he couldn't imagine Jesus loving the whole world and walking past people on the road and not looking twice at the person that he's walking past on the road. And for him, that just blew the whole thing apart. And so nothing matters. There's nothing out there that is real. But what I want to do, I want us to spend a few minutes we'll begin with the Bible verse and the verse we're going to jump off of. But I want to spend a few minutes talking about how we actually know things. And this isn't in the book per se. I think there's some places later on in the chapter that I talk about how do we know right from wrong and how do we know certain things we're going to figure out, where I will mention these things and kind of work through them. But I want to make sure that we consider it before we go. But Romans 1:20 is a verse. Anyone have that one memorized? No? All right. Well, got to start working on the scripture memory around this place. Romans 1:20 says, "For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, so that the things which have been made, so they are without excuse." And so what Paul is telling us 2,000 years ago is that people who believe that reality is unknowable, that ultimate reality is unknowable, that God is unknowable, those people were off track from the beginning. They have no excuse, because it's actually been made clear through God's invisible attributes, which are seen through his creative endeavors. Now, if you look back at the worldviews little diagram, that this is from the book called Darrin. It's on my desk right now. Understanding your worldview, sire. But this is from Stone Street, and what you'll see is, if you look down the ultimate reality is knowable side. So theism is going to be on the knowable side, right? Postmodernism and the unknowable things are going to be down on the other thing. But it's the first four, it's knowable, and there's three choices. It's physical or material, which that's anyone who is a naturalist. And naturalist doesn't just mean that you like trees. It means that the natural world, things that can be touched and felt and heard, the natural world is the ultimate reality. Now, the next group there is that there's a spiritual part of things, which is the ultimate reality, that you can know these things. And that's the transcendental worldviews, which include pantheism and pantheism, polytheism, any of those things. And those are religions like Buddhism and Hinduism, some things like that. Scientology fits in there. So Scientology is kind of popular in America, even though I feel like if you could name 12 Scientologists, you may know half the Scientologists in America, but you could probably name some of them because Tom Cruise and some of those people have made Scientology incredibly popular. But it's not that highly practiced. But that's a spiritual thing. And that, so for the people in that, they think ultimate reality is knowable. And like even what Paul said in our verse in Romans, they can kind of understand that because we can observe and we feel things. And in fact, their group, this group, the spiritual group, they kind of operate off of what we're feeling more than just the natural part of it. It's like, what does this do to us? And how do we think about it? What does it do to our souls? How do we relate to it? In fact, some of these religions are like pantheism. Theism, just monotheism means there is one God, and pantheism means that God is everywhere and everything. And so like God is the chair, God is the desktop and the book, and God is me and God is you, and God is everything, and our big goal there is to just kind of be absorbed into it. Where then you get to the third thing is that, and this is where the three theistic religions and some of the others, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, and then like I've mentioned before, there's some others that fit into this. And a lot of things that are like extra biblical, I would say, fit into this, but this is where there is one God who created everything and he interacts with the world and with nature, but he's not that. Does that make sense? He's everywhere at all times, everywhere, but he is not what he's created. What he's created is separate from him. And so those are how things are dividing out. And this first chapter has to do with is reality knowable? And in this first chapter, I write a little bit about what some of these unknowable type people are thinking, what especially naturalistic atheists, because if theism has an enemy in the discussion world, it almost always goes to naturalistic atheism. And it's always a guy that's the scientist and who don't believe in God and all of that. And so the first chapter kind of lets us think about those kind of relationships. But what I want us to do with the recognition that we believe as theists that God has revealed himself through nature, and a lot of what flows in the book after this comes from the idea that God has shown us through more than just the revealed scriptures, but he's shown us in nature who he really is and what he's about and what he's anticipating, what he wants from us. So what I want us to do then is to think about 5 ways that we know things, how we can know anything. And Katie, this will be the next slide there. And there's 5 real big ways. If anybody, I know George isn't here today, but I know George appreciates William Lane Craig. He's a Christian apologist. When he debates the naturalistic atheist crowd quite often, and whenever you see those debates, is there a God or is there not a God? William Lane Craig is one of the guys who does it, and I really appreciate him for a couple of reasons. One is we use the same interpreter in Russia or Belarus. If he's working doing anything in Russia, he gets our friend from Belarus and she goes and interprets for him. And so I was always kind of, proud / jealous that we were sharing her with William Lane Craig. But I also like him because when he does these debates, you can watch him. And maybe next week I'll give you guys one of his debates. In fact, I'm positive that it's referenced in the index of this book. But he will always do his arguments in these in these orders. He'll talk to you and say, I'm going to give you 5 reasons why you can believe that God exists and He created the universe. Or I'm going to give you 5 reasons why the person of Jesus Christ was real and died and rose again. And as he goes through his reasons, he goes through the 5 reasons. And sometimes he goes through them in the order I'm giving you, which is weakest to strongest. And sometimes he goes through it in the reverse order. But he uses this. These 5 things that I have here, these come from my experimental methodology course that I took in college a long time ago. But it's the way things work. And it's the way we know anything, that we really know anything, and how we can kind of trust what we're knowing and what we're not knowing. And now, what you have here then is an opportunity to compare the people who believe that God is, or reality, ultimate reality, which our ultimate reality is God. But who believe that ultimate reality is not knowable. And if that's the case, then knowing about God is not knowable. It's just, you're kind of out there and you're in trouble with it. But first way is personal experience. And personal experience is, it is a very weak way to kind of know things, to know what's happening is true or not true. For the most part, because it's just incredibly limited. And I always use the example of, the caveman playing around with the first lightning strike, that they get a log and noticing that the deer that was near the log smelled good, and might cut off a chunk of that and eat it, and that's tastier than it is unfired. But if the person doesn't know anything, then he might be, that's amazing. I think I'm going to call that fire. It's so beautiful. Let me feel it, and sticks his hand in it. And he knows forever now not to put your hand in fire, right? Because of personal experience. And you've learned things through personal experience. I want to ask a question, because I think there might be some in here. Were any of you teenagers or young 20s who ever made the statement that I have to experience it or I won't know it's true or not true? I see some guilty smiles. I don't. Some of you are like, I would never do that. I believe that too. But there are some people that are just like, Mom and Dad could tell me not to drink, and Grandma can tell me not to drink, but how do I know if they're telling me the truth? I love them. I think they love me, but who knows what's behind this? And so they just have to try it to know it. And I know people who, they had to find out about marijuana, and they had to find out about meth, and then they had to find out about, and it just keeps going. And it's not just drugs, it's everything. It's how we look at religions. I've been told all my life that church and Christianity is the way to go. But now I'm on my own. I'm in college. I'm just going to see what it's like to live apart from that. And so this idea of personal experience, it really is, when you learn something through personal experience, you probably really learn it pretty well. You do learn not to put your hand on hot things. You do learn you don't eat every mushroom you find on a camping trip. You do learn a lot of things, and you learn them really well. But you only have the totality of your own experience and which you know things. And so if you've never encountered philosophical questions, then, and you are a personal experience, the only thing you know about is maybe, talking to one of your buddies while you're stoned about the stars and thinking that you're getting super, super deep into philosophy. And then when this is a personal story here, when some preacher comes along who's got 40 years of thinking about all this stuff, and you're coming back with, well, you were on a camping trip once, and you had an experience with God, and then the preacher kind of wants to go, but there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people who have thought about this deeply, and they've come to some different conclusions. Personal experience can get you in trouble if that's all you're ever going to rely on. But we rarely just rely on personal experience. But personal experience is not bad. And your story as a follower of Christ, one of the most important parts of your story that make it true and worth sharing with anyone is what you've learned from personal experience. But it's a limited opportunity. So one step beyond that is going to be what's called empirical evidence. Empirical empire, that's kind of what's spread out in front of you. And empirical evidence that's the stuff that I can see. So you have a guy who's watching the first caveman, noticing that a roasted deer might taste better, and then touching the fire. And you got another guy standing about 50 yards away going, I'm not going to do that because of his reaction, right? And that's almost personal experience, but I didn't experience it personally. I'm observing the world around me and I'm seeing things. I can see what hurts. I can see what's dangerous. I can notice that every time I see an animal drink water from that pool, it dies. And that when there's dead animals around pools of water, I'm not going to drink that water no matter how thirsty I am. And that's a way to learn. It's the second best way to learn things. Paul is sort of reaching into that with our scripture that he gave us, that we should be able to use empirical evidence to know what's real and what's not real by just literally lifting up our eyes and looking. And that's where two guys, no matter what is motivating them to be philosophical, on their camp out, may be having a great philosophical conversation because they are looking at the stars. Or they do, in the years gone by, 300 years ago, the real popular argument for God's existence was called the clockmaker argument. And you would think about natural systems and about human bodies, and you would just recognize that something had to put this together. If you found a clock on a beach and you didn't know anything about the way watches or clocks worked, but you found it on the beach and you saw it, you picked it up, and 300 years ago, and you never experienced one of these, you could look at this and go, this is something that was made with intention. I don't know what the intention was because I don't know enough about the stuff yet, but I can recognize that things were intentionally made. One of my favorite atheists was a guy named Anthony Flew. He kind of filled the time space between Bertrand Russell, who was 100 years ago, and then when Bertrand Russell started to pass out, got through his life and died, Anthony Flew took over, and he was the leading atheist for years and years and years. Anthony Flew is the guy who convinced Billy Graham's associate, whose name I'm not thinking of right now, who had preached multiple revivals of Billy Graham for years and years. He convinced him to leave the faith and become an atheist. Some of you might remember who I'm talking about. That would have happened in the 60s. And then by the 70s and 80s, Anthony Flew started giving way to guys. The guy who really loved Anthony Flew is Richard Dawkins, who writes all the God Doesn't Exist books. In Anthony Flew's late life, when he was in his 80s, he was actually on a television show, and there was a Catholic priest and I think it was a Methodist minister, and they were going to do a debate over the question, and they said, Anthony, you can go first. Why do you think God doesn't exist? And Anthony goes, oh, God absolutely exists. And they're all like, okay, you're supposed to be on the other side. And this is on YouTube, you can find it. He's like, God exists. And Anthony Flew's conversion moment is probably what you would Google. But what are you talking about? The religious guys are sitting there and they're like, are you tricking us or what? And he goes, no. He goes, I've been learning about DNA. And he goes, there is no way that DNA is not an instructive written code that has the creative nature and purpose behind it. And the DNA messages in our bodies is that they're intelligent. And there is no way that that is just a result of nature, because it supersedes, it precedes things. And he goes, I believe in God. And the guy's like, are you a Christian? He goes, I'm not there yet. And Richard Dawkins is just like, he's old, he got afraid of dying, and he's just reaching for straws like everybody does. But his thing was based, it was literally the empirical evidence. Now, that was strengthened as we go further through how we know things by some of the other thoughts. But empirical evidence is when you can look around and see what's going on. The third thing is called, it's the method of authority. And this can be, it can be, today I'm doing something and I'm presenting myself as an authority on this. And if you guys come away with any new ideas, it's a way to learn things. But you can see that, like, one of the things that I have is, well, I wrote a book, and in the book I have several pages of references, and that means all the people that are in the bibliography kind of serve as authorities. So there's a lot of people that serve as authorities. School teachers, we learn things and we believe whether they're true or not because authorities tell them to us. Not every authority is good. You guys probably should make sure that I know what I'm talking about, and there's ways to do that. You can look up my references. You can maybe say, he said the exact opposite thing that the reference said, and you go, I can't trust hardly anything he says because one drop will poison the well, you know. And so, but we've got school teachers. A lot of us are thinking, we have so many homeschool kids that meet in this building, and I've met a lot of the homeschool parents. Some of you might be homeschool parents, and part of the reason that we're doing this is we do not trust the authorities that our kids have been put into their hands. I've been reading this article in the last couple of days about a 7-year-old boy. 5 teachers, he's a special needs student, and 5 teachers together agreed and forced him, told him, he said he was getting sick. They said, if you throw up, we're going to make you eat it with a spoon. He threw up, they made him eat it with a spoon. 5 adults on one 7-year-old kid. And I don't care what, there is no explanation for that that's good enough to make that go. And so we need to make sure we can trust our authorities. But we do have authorities. And we call them things like preacher, we call them things like professor, we call them things like doc, you know? The guy that you go to when your neck hurts and your head aches, and he gives you some medicine, and we go to the pharmacist and we're like, they have to know what they're doing. And so we use authorities. Grandma was always a great authority, right? And a lot of times, you know, it's whatever grandma says is what our family does. It's a way we know things to be true. And in the good old days, if grandma said there was God, if mom and dad said there was a God, then we just kind of believed it, unless we really didn't trust authority. And even, who knows why that might happen, but authority is a good way to learn things. You start, when you get authority, that's when you start going, you know what, I love reading C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis becomes an authority for me. And if he says it, even if it's something I wasn't thinking was true before, because that happens to you sometimes. You know, you're reading something and you're just like, no way. Because your first thought is, no way. And then, but then you're like, but C.S. Lewis says this. I need to rethink this. I need to think about this harder. And so you might start thinking about things a little bit harder. You might read a little bit more. And you come to a place where you go, now I know this. An easy place to think about here is, how do we know what is the right thing to do with a misbehaving child? 40 years ago, it was a complete different world than it is now. And people who were raising children 40 years ago are appalled by the methods that people are using to raise children today. And people that are raising children today are appalled by what the older group is telling them what to do. And it's hard to match up. But authority is how we learn truth. It's how we learn anything. And it's a third way. The fourth way is it's reason or logic. And reason and logic are it seems like it should be maybe the best way. And some people actually, C.S. Lewis would say it was the best way. The highest way to know things. The problem, reason and logic only require a couple of observations to be maintained. In good reasoning, not good reasoning, and actual reasoning, and the only way reasoning actually works, you need to know there's 3 rules. There's only 3 rules to it. If something is true in a particular way, place, fashion, it's always true in that particular way, place, and fashion. If something is not true in a particular way, place, and fashion, it's always not true in that same way, place, or fashion. And if it can't be true in a particular way, place, and fashion, and false in that same way, place, and fashion at the same time. Those are the only 3 rules of logic. And you go, well, that's not hard to do, but it's incredibly hard to do because there's over 6,000 in the book that I know, and even Aristotle's logic has a lesser number, but the college book that I used had 6,400 different ways to break those rules in a reasonable argument. So there's only 3 things you have to do, but there's thousands of ways to break them, which I figure is like, if you have a very delicate piece of pottery or something, the only rule is don't break it, but there's 1,000 ways to break it. You know what I mean? And you can throw a baseball at it, you can trip and fall into it, you can hand it to one of the children in the church. There's a million different ways to break it. And so that's what happens with logic. And so logic always requires, it's called a syllogism. And so when you do logic, it has to be kind of put together in, it's A plus B equals C is what the syllogism is. C.S. Lewis is an expert in logic and reason. And that's part of the reason why I like his writing. And it's part of the reason why he's really frustrating, because sometimes people go, this is so simplistic, it can't have any value. But the reason it's simplistic is because he's following the rules and he's following the model. And so it's always going to be A plus B equals C. And so the famous example is all men are mortal, that's A. Socrates is a man, that's B. So Socrates is mortal, right? That's good logic. But if you were to say something like, baseball umpires have good eyesight, carrots produce good eyesight, therefore all baseball umpires eat carrots. That sounds really close to the same thing, but it's not. It's a different thing. And everything, the key problem with that is it's called the violation of the central term, which is the B part. Carrots provide good eyesight. A, that's not been established well enough to do that. It's not established that carrots are the only way to have good eyesight, right? Eyeglasses produce good eyesight. And so it's not therefore all umpires eat carrots. It's like the C can only be what the A. Umpires have good eyesight. Maybe we should, good umpires have good eyesight. And then in the C, it's you're back to good umpires have good eyesight. One of the famous Christian ways that this one gets confused, when it's John 14:6. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Our Christian reasoning takes that very, very quickly to, therefore, you must be a Christian in order to be saved, right? But that's not, I hate to say it, that's not true. The first time I was ever challenged on this was in C.S. Lewis's dang Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe thing, where in the last book, The Great Battle, a soldier for the bad guy, for Tash was the other god that was battling against Aslan, and one of his soldiers dies, and in the moment he dies, he sees Aslan coming towards him, and he recognizes immediately the truth, that he's been serving the wrong god the entire time. And that is the god. Tash was a liar. And he, in his terror and fear, he's also awestruck. And he's thinking thoughts like, just to know the truth for a moment before I die is worth any punishment I'm going to have to face going forward. And Aslan comes to him and says, welcome to the kingdom. And the soldier says, but I never served you, I served Tash. And Aslan is basically saying, you were true and you served as well as you could, and you were true and loyal and noble. And he goes, the service that you've rendered unto Tash, I consider rendered unto me, because it was truthfully rendered. And so join me. And so that's the reason why a lot of pastors will not read C.S. Lewis anywhere, is because he said that. But when C.S. Lewis writes about this in other places, it's not a children's book, he starts talking about the questions that are raised when a man who was angry at God for all of his life, would never go to church, swore and cussed, but when the hand grenade is tossed into the foxhole where he and his mates were, the man leaps on the hand grenade and dies, giving his life for everybody that's around him. And C.S. Lewis says, that's way closer to greater love is no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends. And Jesus then following that with his example, then it is, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and I am the truth. Now, this is a challenging argument, right? And I'm not telling you have to believe that as a theology, but this is how logic kind of works. It's too quick of a jump just to say that you have to be a Christian. No one comes to the Father except through Jesus. Therefore, Jesus is going to make the final call. And I would still say, I would rather just get things squared away and do it the way that we know about, that's easy and that's laid out for us, and live a life that kind of produces confidence in our final situation, then I would trust the fact that maybe there's going to be a hand grenade and I can prove myself at the end. But I have decided in my life 25 years ago that I don't know who's a Christian and who's not. And that's my therefore out of all of that. But this reason and logic are really interesting. And somebody that can do it well, those are really fun conversations to watch. And you can see people that do this well, people who disagree. I love watching videos between this British actor named Russell Brand, who's just a crazy guy, you think. He is a wizard at understanding and using logic. And you see him talking to people that he disagrees with, like Jordan Peterson, who is also very, very good at this. And they have the most amazing conversations and go for hours. And they're so worth listening to because it's two people actually learning from each other and trying to find a path towards truth. So reason and logic are great. The last way that we kind of learn anything is called the scientific method. And that's the way that everybody, it's considered to be the highest and the final method. In that same book that I learned about these 5 ways that we learn things, we learned about scientific method, and it was like, this is the way you know things to be true. And that essentially means that the only person you trust is a scientist. And that's why commercials say that 9 out of 10 scientists think that this is the best toothpaste. And they don't ever talk about, well, the 10th scientist has more degrees and studied it, but whatever. The other guys tried it and liked it. But scientists always have the final word, right? And scientists are like, there is no God, we know that. And if a scientist is a naturalistic atheist, it's because of how we know these things. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But what we have going into this today is just this understanding that the scientific method is understood by most of the world to be the way that we know things to be true or not true. And you can see the battles happening here. When COVID started, it was the scientists are doing this and they want to save our lives.
And then COVID starts moving along, and all of a sudden, some of the things they're doing sounds like maybe they were making guesses. And I was kind of like, I was trying to be generous. I was like, I know that any research you ever do, it takes 5 or 8 years, you know, to figure things out. It can be 10 years down the road, and you know, all the children that got a certain vaccine find out all of a sudden when they're marrying age that they can't have kids. And how do we know that that's not going to happen? And in the good old days, you got a nice 10-year stretch. You try it and go, well, those 20 people don't have any kids. The rest of them do. We shouldn't do that anymore. We were rushed and everything was there, but now you can see the battles going back and forth. That a lot of the people that told us exactly what to do 3 years ago are telling us that they were wrong now. And not just about like vaccines and things, but like what to do with kids. And like we made a terrible mistake by closing the schools down. Just a terrible mistake. It was the wrong thing to do. But science said that it was the right thing to do. But that's the problem. One of the things with the scientific method is the scientific method always leads you to a conclusion. A scientist will have what's called a hypothesis, and then he'll do studies to figure out if the thesis that he believes to be true is true, or if it's just hypothetically true, or if it's not true. Good science will do a study and say, I thought this was going to be the answer, but I've studied now, tested, and I found it's not the answer. I got an A I was the only person who got an A on my final project in my one of my master's things, the clinical counseling thing, because I was the first one in 3 years that what I wrote for my thesis, I disproved rather than proving. And the guy was just so happy that well, what do you think about, I don't even care about the research. You weren't afraid to say you were wrong. And that's what science does. And the real scientists will do that. They'll study it, they'll test it, and they'll go, it's wrong. And so somebody gets something done, they go, this is it, this is right. And they have implications for future research. And they have implications for applying these things. And then 15 other scientists read the paper really hard, and they create a new hypothesis that changes what the first one got, and they add to it. And science is like, this is right, and that's wrong. Now this is right, and now it's wrong. Now this is right. And that's why we used to beat the tar out of kids when they misbehaved, and now we don't. It's because scientific method always changes. It just leads you down. It's a river. And so there's never a conclusion to it. There's never an end to the scientific method. The other thing is the very last chapter of my book, they just emphasize you need several things for the scientific method to work. You need to have absolute control. You need to have repeatability. And there's a couple of other things that have to do with who you're testing and what happens there. But basically, though, in the absolute control and repeatability. And the very basic problem is that the last sentence in the book was, so basically, absolute control is impossible to attain. And which is like, it was just justifying the idea that it keeps changing. And so, is it the best method or not? The other thing is when you take something like, is there a God or is there not? How did the universe begin? You can't repeat it. You can only guess at it. And it's theories. There's nothing different between a scientist who knows everything that you could possibly know about the natural universe and how it began that is any different than us sitting in church saying, everything I know says that there had to be God behind it. And so those are the ways we know things, though. Everything you've ever learned at some level has come into your mode of thinking and your mode of understanding through the 5 things that are presented there. And you can look and say, well, I'm really heavy on. I love authorities. I really like for people just to tell me what to do. Or you can get into the thing that I have to prove it, I have to experience, I have to live it out. But this is how we know things. And so is absolute understanding of anything available to us, and maybe not. But that's how we know things. So the book, the chapter, then as we get through this, again, this is kind of a short chapter, but if you have a book and you want to follow along on pages 41 through probably about 43, we get a couple of these observations. Almost all worldviews believe that reality is knowable. If you look at the diagram that I gave you, everything, the first three big areas at the bottom compared to the fourth, not only are a lot more different possibilities for religions and worldviews, but probably still 90% of the adult world lives within the worldviews that are believing that reality is knowable. It's Western youth, so people that are growing up and get to go to movies when they want to, those are the ones that don't believe that you can know anything anymore. And that's why when they come to church and all the rest of you are like, listen to Darrin, he'll tell you what to do. And you got some college kid here and he's like, why do I listen to this guy? Why did any of these sheep listen to this guy? He doesn't know what's real. He's never lived a minute in my life. He doesn't know what my life is about. But most of the world believes that reality is knowable. And it's not just young people that feel that way. There's many, many, many older people. One of the problems is we're starting to slip into, I don't believe the reality is knowable, even though I'm claiming to be a theist. Even though I'm claiming to believe in God, I still don't know that you can know. And so we tend, in a lot of ways, to kind of give ourselves up a little more easily than we should. Today I'm going to talk about kindness in the sermon, and probably going to talk about some of the stuff that's literally in this thing. And you guys have always heard me talk about there's a difference between kindness and niceness, and I always use the same example that nice is not telling a person they have spinach in their teeth because it might hurt their feelings. Kind is telling them they have spinach in their teeth, even though it'll be embarrassing. It's going to get them through the day, and they're going to know who their real friend is if that's what happens. Sometimes life is tough, and we just have to deal with it that way. And so, almost all worldviews, though, believe that reality is knowable. And if you are a theist, you cannot get away with changing knowable rules or determining that, saying that the Bible's old-fashioned would be a way to kind of express this. A lot of people say, well, the Bible's old-fashioned. I'm a Christian, I believe in Jesus, and what they really believe in is being nice to everybody, because that's probably what their vision of God and Jesus is about. And you can't be telling people that they can't go into a women's locker room if in their heart they feel like they're a woman. And you know what? Reality is knowable. The one sentence that I have in here, it's at the end of page 41 and beginning of page 42. The publisher took it out, and I put it back in when I did the editing, and they didn't catch it until it was too late. But at the bottom of 41, I said, reality is challenging when we cannot figure out how many restrooms public buildings need to provide in order to keep everyone safe, and that the new women's NCAA swimming champ needs a better bikini to hide what modernists still call a bulge. That is over the line, and I realize it. But that's kind of the deal. There's a lot of us who are going, that dude's a dude. And there's a lot of Christian people going, don't you say that. That's me. And so I kind of want us to be careful of kind of understanding that a lot of the crowd that believes that reality is not knowable, a lot of what they will advocate for is under the guise of kindness, but it's not kindness. It's not kindness at all. And in fact, I think I had mentioned at the end of that section, I said, it's a worldview but not a tenable one. Don't embrace it for the kindness it supposedly offers. That's a post worth reading. I mentioned in here some postmodern spin-offs. I talked about things like pragmatism and anti-realism, perspectivism, and anti-essentialism. Most of these things are the postmodern literary takes on things and talking about how to write and read. And almost everything that has to do with knowing whether things are true or not true, when we go back to that list of the 5 things, we start thinking about words and how important words are. C.S. Lewis believed that words contain truth. The only way to actually present truth is with words, and not through images or pictures or even metaphors. In the end, it had to be the words, and words mean things, and they have to stand for what they're getting. But most of the postmodern spin-offs here, if you ever run across a person who is aware of the fact that they are postmodernist, they're probably going to fit into one of those categories, and it's going to be because of the things that they've read. Descartes, I read a little bit in this section. I mentioned him a week ago. Descartes is, he was supposed to be on guard duty. He was thinking about how could he really know anything existed at all, including himself. He finally concludes, I think, therefore I am. And with that, Descartes changed the world. Before that, most of humanity thought that their God or gods were the great I am. And those are capitalized, I am, capitalized all the way through. And we see that scripturally. Theists have a God who even called himself the great I am. Jesus died because he kept repeating that he was the great I am, capital letters all the way. When Descartes said he was I am, everything moved from God is who he says he is to God is who I say he is. And with that, we're moved into the modern world. 500 years later, postmodernism moved us to God is nothing more than an idea. And that's kind of the process there. If you think about this and what the postmodernists do with words, they're deconstructing everything. And the deconstruction is to do away with the idea of truth in words. But Jesus in John 1:1, when it says in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, the word there is logos. And it literally, that word means written word. And so the scripture then it's the greatest revelation of the word. But for postmodernists, they do away with Jesus by doing away with the idea of words can mean things. So Jesus says you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. John 8:32. You will know the truth by knowing me. And so is reality knowable? Is the truth knowable? You know it by knowing Jesus. You know it by knowing the Word. And so postmodernism kind of ruins that. And so anyway, we also have, going from page 43 and 44, theism has the idea in it that God is infinite and unbounded. He's not held by space or time. That's a really important concept in all 3 of the big theistic ideas. But I think especially for Christianity. The mind of God, what God thinks and what God knows, and what God reveals to us is our most secure resting point. It's where we have the greatest opportunity to live a life of faith. And that's why I keep, like, this book is called Understanding Theism 101. The next book that I finally moved on it yesterday, you'll be glad to have it. It's going to show up soon now. That's called Understanding Biblical Mental and Emotional Health 101. And the reason that I'm doing this is because it's the biblical idea of what is true and understanding it at the basic level, a 101 level. That's the greatest place to have security in your life over anything. If any of you have ever done any counseling or therapy or anything like that, I know this for believers, when you find your best path forward, you're finding it when you become aligned with the truth of God's Scripture of what he's trying to reveal to us, and with obedience and kind of understanding and following that. Even believing things that are hard to believe, like suffering is good for you. That's biblical. It's not biblical to say that God doesn't want you to suffer. I don't think God wants you to suffer, but He does. He wants you to have reasons to grow. He wants you to have reasons to move, to change, and to become, and that's usually going to involve suffering. So He sees it as a necessity. But the idea is, I am at my steadiest place when I am finding the mind of God, and the mind of God is revealed. Reality for us is revealed in Scripture, and more than science. Well, what I would argue is because of the limitations of the scientific method, the 5 things I presented, the very, very best ways to know truth in this world is through respected authority that you've tested and found to be true. 1 Thessalonians 5:21 or 17 says, examine all things carefully, hold fast to the good. I feel like it's 21. But the other one says pray unceasingly, which is really good. But that's the best way possibly, with the addition of, if you're really good at reason, that's the better way. And so I would encourage that. Naturalistic atheists, atheism, they believe that cosmic matter is the ultimate reality. There's a battle here that happens between naturalistic atheism and theism that says that God can't exist because we can't test him, and we cannot slip God into the scientific method, and so he therefore doesn't exist. The really great argument. You guys want to watch a good one? Watch Connell and Richard Dawkins, and this Lutheran satire is what the thing's called, and they're 1,500 years ago shepherds who were really Irish and really antagonistic. But they're like, Richard Dawkins is like, you poor simple people, you don't understand that people don't rise from the dead. And they go, we know. And he's like, why are you talking about it? Because that one guy who rose from the dead. And they're like, he's like, that can't happen. Why? Because people don't rise from the dead. And they're like, except for that one guy who rose from the dead. They just keep insisting on the one guy. And they're like, it's a surprise to us too. And but for the naturalistic atheists, they're done with the argument from the beginning when you introduce anything that's supernatural. And so the 3 big religions all believe that God is. That's when God says I am. Each Judaism, Islam, and Christianity all start with the idea that God is whatever comes after that, and whatever's for a Christian, it's anything he says in the Bible. God's relationship with reality is that he created the reality, not that he kind of exists within it. He's outside of it. I have a thing there where I talk about he supersedes nature, and then I'm like super nature, and then supernatural, and that's kind of the deal. We believe in the supernatural. God is not a part of the reality, but he created it, he's behind it, and therefore he's untestable. But there are things that even an atheist, naturalistic atheist, has to be curious about. It's things about like love, justice, beauty, peace, a lot of these concepts that we feel evil, that we kind of recognize are there, but they're also not measurable scientifically. I'm behind, so I'm going to wrap this up. Pages 47 through 48, the implications of God's creative power. One of the things that I write about there is that if God really did make everything, and if he really is the ultimate reality behind our existence, we are required to consider what it is that he's asked us to believe about himself. And one of those things that I write about is he asks us to love everybody. Nobody's out of bounds for who we're going to love. And my plea there was, the question I ask in the book is, but who are we going to hate? And we're not supposed to hate anybody. We can love people, even those that we disagree with, to a great degree. When I talk about kindness today, I got a difficult spot in there where I need to say that not everyone should be the recipient of our kindness. But I don't know that we have, when God puts the person in front of us to be kind to, we're going to have to do that. And it's a hard thing. I'll talk about it more, during the sermon. God is our ultimate reality. He's not only our ultimate reality, but he's divine. And I think that's important. Distinction is that God is he's the divine creator. And when you kind of look into what the word God, it has to do with holiness, goodness, and so to recognize him in that way. I talk in here about vision, hope, and despair. Very difficult places to go. Somebody who does not believe in knowledge is their knowledge is unknowable. It's very hard for those people to have any sense of vision, any sense of hope, and they get stuck in this quite often.
We're the welcoming committee. There you go.
Learning is dystopian. Do you notice how many of the young people books are all about crazy post-apocalyptic worlds where nobody's in charge, terrible people are in charge, and all that. And so that's the result of so, all right, that's what I have. And are there any questions from you guys? All right. Zig says no questions. So, oh, I know what's happening today.
How did you get your book for Gold Piano?
I carried that in. No, last time I told you the story. We had some bloopers in it. Was a gift. The piano was a gift. We had a great piano for a long time. It was just simply being scored on the
Dude, I just did this.
Yeah.